Hello, everybody. This is Gary. Today is October 19th, 2021. It's 1:24 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the United States and Rochester, New York. And this is my coping with schizophrenia vlog entry for today. Today, I wanted to talk about caffeine, psychosis, and schizophrenia. I personally take in a lot of caffeine every day, about 4 or 5 cups, and there's 100 to 200 milligrams in each cup of coffee. I happen to drink instant coffee. I don't brew coffee, but I do have an intake of coffee, especially since I quit smoking for some odd reason. That makes me take in even more caffeine. Um, but I wanted to read an article from the American Psychiatric Association and its findings on schizophrenia and people who use caffeine. Should patients with schizophrenia avoid caffeine? To answer this question, we reviewed 4 areas of research: caffeine intake among persons with schizophrenia, effects of caffeine on dopamine systems in non humans, effects of caffeine on positive and negative symptoms, and interactions of caffeine with antipsychotic medications. This article is called Alcohol and Drug Abuse, Caffeine and Schizophrenia by Dr. John R. Hughes, MD, Pauline McHugh, MD, and Stephen Holtzman, PhD, published November 1st, 1998, from the website psychiatryonline.org. About 85% of the U.S. population uses caffeine daily. The most common sources are brewed coffee, 100 milligrams of caffeine per 6-ounce serving; instant coffee, 65 milligrams; tea, 40 milligrams; soda, 35 milligrams; and chocolate, 5 milligrams. The mean caffeine intake is near 210 milligrams a day for the whole population, and 6% are heavy users, more than 500 milligrams a day. Several reasons exist for hypothesizing that persons with schizophrenia would have high caffeine intakes. For example, patients may use caffeine to combat apathy or boredom, or to offset the sedating effects of antipsychotic medications. Many persons with schizophrenia have polydipsia, and caffeine intake might increase as a result. Similarly, many psychiatric medications produce dry mouth, which might increase intake. In addition, as reviewed below, caffeine might improve negative symptoms of schizophrenia or extrapyramidal symptoms from neuroleptic drugs. Patients taking neuroleptics may have reduced anxiety, allowing them to imbibe more caffeine. Final possibility is that approximately 80% of persons with schizophrenia smoke cigarettes, and many of them smoke heavily. Smoking increases the elimination of caffeine; thus, persons with schizophrenia may use more caffeine to make up for increased elimination of caffeine due to heavy cigarette smoking. Several authors have anecdotally noted high caffeine intake among patients with schizophrenia, included cases of eating raw coffee. For example, in one study, the 15 lowest users averaged 4.6 cups of coffee a day. 2 empirical surveys of caffeine used by persons with schizophrenia were published more than 20 years ago, in 1975 and 1976. In a German study of inpatients, 71% used more than 500 milligrams caffeine a day. However, in a Canadian study of both inpatients and outpatients, only 17% used more than 500 milligrams a day, and this consumption was no different from the 11% in the general population who did so. The discrepant figures across these two studies are probably not due to cultural differences, because coffee intake in Canada and Germany were similar in 1976. It is more likely that high prevalence rate in the German study was due to institutionalization, which appears to increase caffeine use, or because the German study included more severely ill patients. We could find only one more recent survey of caffeine use among persons with schizophrenia. The mean caffeine intake of 26 patients was 503 milligrams a day, and 38% reported using more than 555 milligrams a day. Effects of caffeine on dopamine systems. Caffeine has well-documented effects on dopamine, major neurotransmitter of interest in schizophrenia. Unlike the non-xanthine psychomotor stimulants amphetamine and cocaine, caffeine neither releases dopamine from nerve terminals nor prevents reuptake of released dopamine. Rather, caffeine and other methylxanthines, such as theophylline, are competitive antagonists at the A2A adenosine receptor on the same postsynaptic neurons as the D2 dopamine receptor. Activation of the A2A receptor makes dopamine less efficient as a neurotransmitter. Thus, by blocking this receptor, caffeine enhances the ability of dopamine to function as a neurotransmitter. Caffeine enhancement of dopamine function appears to explain several behavioral effects of caffeine. For example, caffeine, like amphetamine, increases the locomotor activity of rats, and this effect is prevented by neuroleptics, which are antipsychotic drugs. Also, rats can be trained to recognize an injection of caffeine. Such trained rats identify injection of drugs that activate dopamine receptors, such as amphetamine, as being like caffeine. Caffeine's effect on dopamine may also play a role in tardive dyskinesia. Upregulation of dopamine receptors is thought to be a principal cause of tardive dyskinesia. This upregulation is accompanied by upregulation of A2A adenosine receptors. Because caffeine antagonizes the A2A receptor, caffeine intake might exacerbate and caffeine abstinence might improve tardive dyskinesia. To date, no study has explicitly tested this hypothesis. Several case reports have described delusions and hallucinations after large intakes of caffeines by persons with and without schizophrenia. One study of 78 patients with schizophrenia found that caffeine intake was correlated with the total score on the Brief Psychiatric Rating Scale, BPRS, with the score on a scale measuring positive symptoms but not with scales measuring negative symptoms or extrapyramidal symptoms. Unfortunately, the magnitude of the effect on the BPRS score was not reported. However, when symptoms of schizophrenia and caffeine intake were followed over time, and a small sample of 14 patients, only a slight correlation between caffeine intake and severity of psychosis was found. 3 studies have compared the symptoms of inpatients using caffeinated coffee or decaffeinated coffee. One study used a caffeinated caffeinated design in which inpatients alternated use for 3-week periods. Scores on the anxiety and hostility subscale of the BPRS self-reported, and irritability scores on the nurse's observation scale for inpatient evaluation, nurse-rated, were higher during caffeinated coffee periods, indicating a greater level of symptoms. Actual scores were not reported, thus clinical significance of these changes is unknown. Second study used a caffeinated design with 4 to 7 weeks in each period. These results were confounded by a trend for all scores to improve over time. Nevertheless, scores on subscales for hostility, hallucinations, and unusual thought content on the BPRS and irritability and psychosis scores on the NOSI showed the expected high-low pattern. Traditional statistical tests failed to find significant differences. However, statistical tests that test specifically for the high-low pattern expected may very well have shown statistical significance. On the other hand, the changes that did occur were small and may not have been clinically significant. The third study used the decaffeinated, caffeinated, decaffeinated design with 1 week in each period. Inpatient scores for anxiety and depression and total scores on the BRS and NOSI did not change across periods. In only one study has caffeine been experimentally administered to patients. Caffeine, 10 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, was administered intravenously to persons with schizophrenia who had been caffeine-free for 6 weeks. Caffeine increased the BRS total score and the score on the unusual thought subscale, as well as global nurse ratings of psychosis. These results are similar to those of the previous studies. The change in the PRS total score was large, a 33% increase, and occurred for 10 of the 13 subjects. In addition, caffeine improved negative symptoms, that is, it improved mood and decreased withdrawal. Interesting, this large dose did not increase anxiety scores among these patients. Although these results are the most direct evidence that caffeine can worsen positive symptoms and might even improve negative symptoms, their generalizability may be limited because this study used a very large dose of caffeine, the equivalent of drinking 7 cups of brewed coffee at once. Also, caffeine was administered intravenously, and the subjects had presumably lost any tolerance to caffeine. In addition, this study did not have a control group of persons without schizophrenia. Thus, the specificity of the findings is debatable. This lack of specificity is important because high doses of intravenous caffeine can cause psychotic symptoms among individuals without a history of psychosis. Caffeine use and caffeine cessation produce other effects that, although not specifically relevant to schizophrenia, could influence the cause and presentation of the illness or be confused with medication side effects. Caffeine use can cause restlessness, nervousness, insomnia, rambling speech, and agitation. Whether chronic heavy caffeine users develop enough tolerance that these symptoms are of little concern is debatable. In addition, cessation of caffeine causes fatigue and drowsiness, which could be confused with prodromal or postdromal symptoms or medication side effects. Interaction of coffee and tea with antipsychotics. The addition of coffee or tea to phenothiazine, which is Thorazine, or butyrophenol neuroleptic elixirs, forms a precipitant in vitro. This precipitation is not due to the caffeine in coffee or tea. Initially, this finding was of concern because patients might drink coffee or tea immediately after receiving oral medication. However, in humans, caffeine use is only slightly related to neuroleptic levels in one study, and a caffeinated, caffeinated protocol showed no effect of caffeine on neuroleptic levels. A later study concluded that these negative findings in humans occurred because stomach acidity reverses any precipitation. Thus, whether the caffeine neuroleptic precipitation phenomenon has any clinical significance is unclear. More recent evidence suggests that caffeine may potentiate side effects from clozapine, which is an antipsychotic drug. In contrast to traditional neuroleptics, clozapine is metabolized mostly by the cytochrome P450 CYP1A2 isoenzyme, which is also the enzyme responsible for the metabolism of caffeine. Thus, caffeine and clozapine may compete for the CYP1A2 isoenzyme. One case report in the literature suggests that caffeine use can increase clozapine levels sufficiently to produce clinically significant side effects. Unfortunately, further empirical studies of the validity, prevalence, and clinical significance of this possibly important interaction have not been published. Finally, high doses of caffeine can cause tremor and appear to cause restless legs, both of which could be mistaken for could aggravate neuroleptic-induced extrapyramidal symptoms. On the other hand, a recent open-label study suggested that theophylline, a metabolite of caffeine, can improve Parkinsonian symptoms. Summary: although the database is small, not completely consistent, it appears that patients with schizophrenia have high caffeine intakes. The reasons are unclear. In non-humans, caffeine enhances the effects of dopamine, which might be expected to worsen positive symptoms and improve negative symptoms of schizophrenia and worsen tardive dyskinesia. Eliminating caffeine among patients with schizophrenia does not appear to make them better or worse. Acute intake of large amounts of caffeine may increase psychosis and hostility. However, those who chronically use large amounts of caffeine may develop enough tolerance that these adverse effects do not occur. But whether this conjecture is true has not been tested. Interestingly, persons with schizophrenia do not develop anxiety at high doses of caffeine. Although there was initial concern that caffeine might inactivate liquid doses of neuroleptics, the clinical significance of this concern is unclear. On the other hand, caffeine might increase the level of clozapine, and more research in this area is needed. Acknowledgement. This work was supported by grant DA-04843 to Dr. Hughes, Research Scientist Development Award DA-00109 to Dr. Hughes, and DA-00008 to Dr. Holzman, and Institutional Training Grant T32 DA-07242 to Dr. McHugh from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Dr. Hughes is professor in the Department of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Family Practice at the University of Vermont, 30 Fletcher Place, Burlington, Vermont, 05401 1419. Email john.hughes@uvm.edu. Dr. McHugh is a resident in the Department of Psychiatry at New York University. Dr. Holzman is professor in the Department of Pharmacology at Emory University in Atlanta. Richard J. Francis, MD, is editor of this column. So there you have it, folks. That's what caffeine does and doesn't do in schizophrenia. In the end, for me, caffeine helps keep me going through the day. And sometimes it seems to worsen my anxiety and my hallucinations. That column that I just read seems to contradict that. But the summary of the column that I just read was that the results of caffeine intake on schizophrenia are kind of unclear. I believe I use so much caffeine I've built up a tolerance to it, and my anxiety would be a lot worse if I didn't build up a tolerance to it. I have talked to my own psychiatrist about my caffeine intake, and we both agreed it might be better if I decreased my caffeine intake to reduce insomnia and anxiety. Comment, like, share, subscribe. If you want to help my channel financially, I'll put a link in the description to my PayPal fundraiser Share this video on social media. It will help my channel grow. Press the notification bell when you want to know when I put out new videos. And if you want a video on a specific subject, leave it in the comment section.